In 1979, a man named Barry Campbell was transferred to Wormwood Scrubs prison in West London. He had been convicted of a criminal offence. He was entitled, under the law of England and Wales, to serve his sentence in conditions that did not include being beaten by the people paid to guard him. Within weeks of his arrival at Wormwood Scrubs, he had been systematically assaulted by prison officers. He was not the only one. An investigation conducted by the Home Office found that a group of prison officers at Wormwood Scrubs had been conducting systematic violence against prisoners over an extended period. The investigation was real. The evidence was documented. The findings were clear. The number of Wormwood Scrubs prison officers who were subsequently convicted of any criminal offence in connection with the systematic violence that the investigation found was 0. In this video, we are counting down 13 British prisons that were worse than the crimes that sent people to them, not the prison conditions that were simply inadequate. The prisons where the documented treatment of the people inside crossed into territory that, if it had been conducted anywhere other than inside a prison by anyone other than prison officers, would have been prosecuted as assault, as torture, as criminal neglect. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a prison whose name has become synonymous with one specific and documented horror, and whose record over the full span of its history reveals a pattern of institutional behavior that the British justice system has never been required to fully account for. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. On the 24th of January 1932, prisoners at Dartmoor prison on the Devon Moor staged what the authorities called a mutiny, and what subsequent investigation found was a collective response to conditions that had deteriorated to a point that the prisoners found intolerable. The Dartmoor mutiny resulted in significant damage to prison property, injuries to prison officers and prisoners, and a response by armed police who opened fire on prisoners in the exercise yard. Several prisoners were shot and wounded. None died, though the firing of firearms at prisoners in an exercise yard remains one of the most extreme uses of force in the history of the British prison system. The conditions that preceded the mutiny had been the subject of complaint from prisoners and concern from prison reform organisations for years. The prison, situated on one of the harshest moorland environments in England, experienced cold that was severe even by the standards of a prison estate that made no particular provision for warmth. The food was inadequate, the work was hard, the regime was rigid. The inquiry that followed the mutiny, the Du Parc inquiry, found that some of the prisoners' complaints about conditions were justified. It also found that the mutiny itself was unjustified. The findings that justified the complaints, and the findings that justified the response to them, sat in the same report without producing any significant reform of the conditions that had produced the collective action. The moor is still there. The prison is still operating. The conditions that produced the 1932 mutiny have been reformed in some respects and not reformed in others. The use of firearms against prisoners in an exercise yard has not been repeated. The fact that it happened once has not been made a prominent part of Dartmoor's institutional identity. Broadmoor Hospital in Berkshire is not technically a prison. It is a high-security psychiatric hospital, the oldest of its kind in Britain, having operated since 1863. But the people held inside Broadmoor have not always been there voluntarily, have not always been there for reasons that subsequent understanding of mental health would validate, and have been held in conditions that the distinction between hospital and prison has not always been sufficient to make meaningfully different from imprisonment. Broadmoor was built to hold the criminally insane, the Victorian category that covered everyone from people with serious psychotic conditions who had committed violent offences to people whose offences were relatively minor but whose behaviour or identity was considered sufficiently deviant to warrant indefinite institutional detention. The category of criminal insanity was elastic in ways that the Victorian era applied with considerable social convenience. Women who were inconvenient could be committed. Men whose sexuality was considered disordered could be detained. People whose poverty-related behavior crossed certain lines could be institutionalized indefinitely. Broadmoor held Jimmy Savile's pass for decades, allowing him unmonitored access to patients. This channel covered this in the institutions video. What belongs specifically in this prison video is the broader pattern. Broadmoor was an institution whose patients, in many cases, had no mechanism for challenging the length of their detention, no fixed sentence, no release date, and conditions that oscillated between those of a psychiatric ward and those of a prison, depending on who was running the ward on any given day. The Victorian indefinitely detained are not a category for whom comprehensive justice has ever been sought. In the far northeast of Scotland, in the town of Peterhead in Aberdeenshire, a granite prison that operated from 1888 until 2013 became notorious across its history for conditions and incidents that placed it among the most troubled institutions in the Scottish prison system. Peterhead was built partly using the labour of its own prisoners, who quarried the local red granite from which the prison is constructed. The specific use of prisoner labour in the construction of the walls that would contain them is a detail that did not become part of Peterhead's institutional identity. The prison housed some of Scotland's most serious offenders across its 125 years of operation. It also housed people in conditions that the Scottish prison reform organisations documented consistently as inadequate, violent, and in some periods grossly disproportionate to the management of even a high-security population. The most documented period of Peterhead's troubled history is the 1980s and 1990s, when a series of riots, rooftop protests, and hostage-taking incidents drew public attention to conditions inside. The 1987 Peterhead riot, in which prisoners took a prison officer hostage, occupied the prison's rooftop, and caused significant damage to the buildings, was eventually resolved by the SAS. The deployment of special forces to resolve a prison incident is not a standard operational response. It represents a level of institutional failure that is worth examining directly. The inquiry that followed found serious issues with the management of the prison and with the conditions that had produced sustained prisoner resistance over years. Peterhead closed in 2013. It has been converted to a prison museum. Visitors can now walk the cell landings and experience the granite walls that prisoners quarried and that subsequent prisoners lived in for 125 years. On the 1st of April 1990, a riot began at Strangeways prison in Manchester that lasted for 25 days and became the longest prison siege in British penal history. The riot began during a Sunday chapel service. Prisoners overpowered the officers present, took the keys, and systematically opened cells across the prison. Within hours, the prison was effectively under prisoner control. One prisoner died during the riot. Over 190 prison officers were injured. The damage to the prison was estimated at approximately £90 million. The riot was not a spontaneous event. It was the culmination of conditions that the prison reform organisation, the Howard League, had been documenting and criticising for years. Strangeways was severely overcrowded. Cells designed for one person held 2 and sometimes 3. Sanitation was inadequate. Prisoners, in many cases, had to slop out, emptying the buckets that served as their toilet in a morning queue that was degrading and that the prison system had been repeatedly told was unacceptable. Lord Justice Wolfe, who conducted the inquiry that followed the riot, found that the conditions at Strangeways and across the English and Welsh prison system were such that the riot, while not justified, was explicable. The Wolfe Report was one of the most significant prison reform documents in British penal history. It led to the ending of slopping out as a practice across the prison estate. It produced a range of recommendations for the humanisation of conditions. Not all of those recommendations were implemented. The prison is now called HMP Manchester. The building is largely the same building in which 25 Days of Riot produced the most significant prison reform report in a generation. Wormwood Scrubs Prison in West London opened its Victorian gates in 1891 and has operated continuously since. It housed Oscar Wilde briefly before his transfer. It housed numerous conscientious objectors during the First World War, in conditions that were specifically brutal. It was the location of Cold War spy exchanges in adjacent areas. And in the 1970s, it was the location of a documented program of systematic violence against prisoners that a Home Office investigation confirmed, and that resulted in no criminal convictions. The investigation, which examined a period of systematic assaults by prison officers on prisoners in Wormwood Scrubs D Wing, found clear evidence of organised violence. Officers had been beating prisoners. The beatings were not random, they were organised. They involved officers who coordinated what they were doing and who created a culture in which this behaviour was normalised among those who participated in it and kept silent by those who knew and did not report it. The Director General of the Prison Service acknowledged in 1982 that abuses had taken place. 14 officers faced disciplinary proceedings. The disciplinary proceedings were internal. No criminal charges were brought against any of the officers who had conducted or enabled the systematic violence. The prisoners who had been assaulted received no compensation through any mechanism that could be called adequate. The Home Secretary at the time, William Whitelaw, made a statement acknowledging that serious events had occurred. The governor at the time of the most serious incidents received no public sanction. Wormwood Scrubs continues to operate. It is classified as a Category B men's prison. Its history of systematic officer violence against prisoners is not a prominent feature of its institutional identity. In 1895, Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency under the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885 and sentenced to 2 years hard labour. He served part of his sentence at Reading Gaol in Berkshire, and the experience destroyed his health and effectively ended his creative life. He died 3 years after his release. The conditions at Reading Gaol under which Wilde served his sentence were the standard conditions of the Victorian prison system. They were not exceptional by the standards of the time. That is the point. They were standard. The hard labour, the silence rules that prevented prisoners from speaking to each other for extended periods, the inadequate diet, the physical conditions of the cells, the isolation, the specific degradations of the Victorian penal regime applied to a man convicted of a sexual offence between consenting adults in private were not aberrations from the system. They were the system. Wilde's experience at Reading is documented, in his own words, in The Ballad of Reading Gaol, the poem he wrote after his release, and in De Profundis, the long letter he wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas from prison. These documents are literary masterpieces. They are also primary sources for the conditions of the Victorian prison system applied to a man whose offence, under any contemporary legal framework in Britain, would not have been an offence at all. Reading Gaol closed as a prison in 2013. It has been partially used as an arts venue. The cell in which Wilde was held is preserved. The law under which he was convicted, the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885, was not repealed in its relevant sections until 1967. The people convicted under that law who were not Oscar Wilde, who did not produce literary masterpieces from their experience, who died in prison or in poverty after their release, are not memorialized at Reading Gaol or anywhere else. And hey, before we reach the final 5, if this video is showing you a British prison system that has consistently done things to the people inside it that it has never been fully required to account for, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks the British justice system has always been just. Now, let's continue. Holloway Prison in North London, which operated as a women's prison from 1903 until its closure in 2016, was the location in which suffragettes who were imprisoned for their political activities were subjected to force feeding when they went on hunger strike. The force feeding of suffragette prisoners was a deliberate government policy. The suffragettes were imprisoned for offences, including criminal damage and public order offences connected to their campaign for women's right to vote. When they went on hunger strike in prison, the government, rather than release them, authorized the force feeding of prisoners who refused food. Force feeding, in the context of a hunger striking prisoner who is refusing food as a political statement, constitutes the forcible invasion of the body of a prisoner who has not consented. Medical opinion in the period was divided about whether it was an appropriate clinical intervention. Medical opinion was unanimous that it was painful, distressing, and potentially dangerous. Suffragettes who were force-fed described the procedure in terms that can only be described as accounts of assault. The government that authorized the force feeding of suffragette prisoners was never held accountable for doing so. The Cat and Mouse Act of 1913, which allowed hunger-striking prisoners to be released temporarily until they were well enough to be re-imprisoned, was a further elaboration of a policy toward a specific category of political prisoner that has never been subject to the retrospective accountability that the suffragette campaign for democracy has otherwise received. Barlinnie Prison in Glasgow is one of Scotland's most overcrowded and most troubled institutions. It has been the subject of prison reform criticism for decades. It has also been the location of one of the most remarkable experiments in penal philosophy in 20th century British prison history. Between 1973 and 1995, Barlinnie operated a special unit for a small number of its most violent prisoners. Prisoners who had been deemed unmanageable in the mainstream prison environment, and who under the standard regime had continued to be violent and disruptive. The special unit operated on entirely different principles from the mainstream prison. Prisoners had their own keys, they could decorate their cells, they had access to art materials, to craft equipment, to a social environment in which they and the staff were expected to interact as people, rather than as prisoner and guard. The results were extraordinary. Jimmy Boyle, who had been one of the most violent prisoners in the Scottish prison system, became a sculptor of genuine merit, whose work was exhibited publicly, and who became an advocate for penal reform. The special unit produced outcomes that the mainstream Scottish prison system could not produce. It was closed in 1995, in part because of political discomfort with what were characterized as the luxury conditions available to serious offenders. The luxury conditions were being spoken to as a person, having access to creative materials, and not being brutalized. The closure of the special unit and the return to mainstream prison conditions of the kind of management that had been shown not to work with this population represents one of the clearest examples in British penal history of a successful experiment being ended for political rather than evidential reasons. Pentonville Prison in North London opened in 1842 and has operated continuously since, making it one of the oldest operational prisons in Britain. For much of its history, it was also an execution site. Between 1902 and 1961, 120 people were hanged at Pentonville. They were hanged in a purpose-built execution chamber within the prison walls. The bodies of those executed were buried within the prison grounds. Among those executed at Pentonville was Dr. Harvey Crippen, hanged in 1910 for the murder of his wife, a case that remains disputed by some forensic scientists who have re-examined the evidence. Among those executed was Roger Casement, hanged in 1916 for high treason, connected to his role in the Easter Rising, a case that the Irish government has consistently argued was wrongful in the context of Irish independence. Among those executed were men convicted on evidence that subsequent forensic understanding would have questioned, men whose appeals failed for procedural reasons that had nothing to do with the merits of their cases, and men who may have been innocent. The number of wrongful executions at Pentonville and at the other execution sites across England and Wales that operated until the abolition of the death penalty in 1965 is not known. It cannot be known, because the irreversibility of execution means that the cases cannot be corrected after the fact. The graves of those executed at Pentonville are within the prison grounds. They are not publicly accessible. The people buried there are not publicly memorialized. The prison operates above them every day. Long Lartin Prison in Worcestershire is one of Britain's highest security prisons, holding Category A prisoners who are considered the most dangerous or the most at risk of escape in the prison system. It has also been the location of two significant incidents in its relatively recent history. In 1987, a prisoner took an officer hostage. In 2000, a prisoner was murdered by another prisoner. In 2012, a prison officer was attacked. The pattern at Long Lartin, as at other high-security prisons in England and Wales, raises the specific question of what conditions are appropriate for the long-term detention of very high-risk prisoners in a system that does not have the dedicated supermax infrastructure that exists in the United States, but that does hold some of the same population. The British prison system's approach to high-risk prisoners involves concentrating them in dispersal prisons, high-security institutions that hold dangerous prisoners alongside a general population. The dispersal prison philosophy was developed after the Mountbatten Report of 1966 as an alternative to the American concentration model. It has been the subject of sustained debate about whether it is safer for the prisoners and staff who live and work in dispersal prisons than the concentration alternatives. The incidents at Long Lartin and at other dispersal prisons across the history of the system have not resolved that debate. The prisoners in Long Lartin include some of the most serious offenders in British criminal history. The conditions under which they are held, and the conditions under which the staff who work there live their professional lives, are a question that the British prison system has been answering with the dispersal model since 1966, without producing a settled evidential consensus that the answer is correct. From 1776 until 1857, the British government used decommissioned ships moored in rivers and harbours as floating prisons. The prison hulks, as they were known, held overflow prisoners during a period when the prison estate was inadequate for the population it was supposed to contain, and when transportation to Australia was either unavailable or insufficient to absorb the numbers. The hulks were used at Woolwich on the Thames, at Gosport on Portsmouth Harbour, at Chatham on the Medway, and at other anchorages around the coast of Britain. They held prisoners in conditions that were, by any contemporary account, significantly worse than those of the land-based prisons of the period. The ships were overcrowded, badly ventilated, cold in winter, hot in summer, and rife with disease. Typhus, dysentery, and scurvy were endemic. The mortality rate on the hulks was significantly higher than in the land prisons. Prisoners were required to work during the day, in many cases on dredging operations or other heavy labour on the rivers and harbour shores where the ships were moored. The conditions on the hulks were documented by reformers, including John Howard, whose 1777 work, The State of the Prisons in England and Wales, described the hulks in terms that were clear about their inadequacy. The hulks were not a temporary emergency measure that became unnecessary as soon as alternatives were available. They operated for 81 years. Dickens used them in Great Expectations, where the young Pip encounters the escaped convict Magwitch on the Thames marshes. The literary representation of the hulks is more widely known than the documented reality of the mortality rates of the people who were held on them. And now we have reached number 1. Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire, known within the British prison system as Monster Mansion, is the institution that holds a higher concentration of convicted sex offenders and the most serious violent offenders than any other prison in England and Wales. It is a dispersal prison. It has been a prison since 1594. making it one of the oldest continuously operated prison sites in Britain. What makes Wakefield number one in this video is not any single incident. It is a pattern that has accumulated across decades, and that raises the most fundamental question about what the British prison system is for. Wakefield has held, across its modern history, a number of prisoners whose offences were so serious that the public discussion of their names, their crimes, and their management in prison has shaped the national conversation about punishment, rehabilitation, and what the state owes and does not owe to people who have done the worst things. It held Ian Huntley, convicted of the Soham murders. It held Robert Maudsley, who killed 4 people, including 3 in prison, and who has been held in a special cell in Wakefield's basement for over 40 years, in conditions that Maudsley himself has described as solitary confinement at its most extreme, and that prison reform organizations have characterized as a form of torture. Maudsley has not killed anyone since being placed in his basement cell. He has also not been provided with any meaningful human contact, any meaningful mental health treatment, or any meaningful engagement with the question of what his continued existence in those conditions is supposed to achieve. He is still there. The cell is still in the basement. The question of what the British prison system is doing to Robert Maudsley, and why, has never been answered in any public forum with the directness and honesty it requires.